This film is a continuation of the last one, in which Kenshin is trapped on a beach while attempting to rescue Kaoru, who is drowned in the water by Makoto's men. Kenshin was pulled away by big waves after failing to locate Kaoru and collapsing on a beach. A strange guy discovered Kenshin and took him to his residence for treatment shortly after he became stranded. The action then shifts to an island, where a youngster is attempting to bury 3 people who were killed in an assault. The youngster merely said that he wanted to properly bury the victims and pay their final respects to them. After the guy inquired about the boy's identity, it was discovered that he was born Kenshin and still goes by his given name, Shinta. After seeing Shinta's excellent potential as a samurai, the mystery guy changes Shinta's name to Kenshin and asks Kenshin to accompany him. Hiko Seijiro, a guy, vowed to teach Kenshin to become a great swordsman in the future. Kenshin awoke from his dream of his first encounter with his master and found himself at an ancient house, which turned out to be his master's residence. Seijiro is revealed to be the strange guy who discovers Kenshin on the beach and takes him to his residence. Hearing this, Kenshin inquired as to whether Seijiro had discovered a female who drifted with him, but he said that he had just found Kenshin alone. He said that Kenshin had been asleep for 3 days, thus whomever was floating along with Kenshin was most certainly dead. Kenshin then requested that his teacher assist him in learning a hidden sword technique known as Hiten Mitsurugi. He has to acquire sword skill since he is about to fight a formidable rebel samurai named Makoto Shizuo. Fortunately, Seijiro agrees to Kenshin's request, but first he wants to test Kenshin's talents before teaching the technique. Meanwhile, on a Tokyo beach, inhabitants on the move were taken aback by the sight of Makoto's massive battleship, and they dashed towards the city to alert the other residents. Makoto fired numerous guns when his big vessel moored on a Tokyo beach. As a consequence, civilians and police officers had no choice but to flee in terror. At the same time, Masao saved Okina, who had been gravely hurt by Aoshi's assault. She didn't think Aoshi, a former captain of the Ano Wabanshu team, would be so nasty to Okina, a former member of the Ano Wabanshu squad. She was furious with Aoshi after that occurrence and planned to get vengeance on him. Back to Kenshin, who was continuing honing his sword against Seijiro, who easily defeated Kenshin despite just using a wooden stick as a weapon. He advises Kenshin not to abuse Hiten Mitsurugi's action, which should be utilized to defend vulnerable people rather than for political advantage. Kenshin then said that he would continue to learn this art in order to alleviate suffering in that nation and bring peace to the Japanese people. Meanwhile, Makoto's warriors, who had docked their battleships on a Tokyo beach, planned to meet with Prime Minister Hito Hirobumi, a government envoy who wanted to talk. Makoto pledged not to attack Tokyo if Hito agreed to give over Kenshin and execute him in front of them. When Hito learned of these circumstances, he had no alternative but to sacrifice Kenshin in order to preserve Tokyo and the Japanese government. Soon after, Hito and the government started distributing poster pamphlets across the city in order for anybody to report Kenshin's location to the police. Kenshin was now an official fugitive from the government, and he would be killed in front of rebel troops. The Ano Wabanshuan has received word that Kenshin would be executed by the authorities. Sanosuke and the others are very upset with the government's decision. They were concerned since they still didn't know where Kenshin and Kaoru were. At the same time, they were relieved to learn that Kenshin was still alive. Soon later, they learned that Kaoru had been discovered and was being treated at a hospital. Sanosuke and the others raced to the hospital to see whether she was all right. When they got at the hospital, she was still unconscious and had a high temperature. Kenshin, on the other hand, is still attempting to defeat his master, who only fights with a wooden stick. Despite being thrown down repeatedly by Seijiro's strikes, Kenshin did not give up and kept battling him. Kenshin was reminded of previous recollections during that training when he continued attempting to get back up despite his instructor constantly knocking him down. At the same time, Okina, now fully awake, directed Masao to locate Kenshin after learning that he was still alive. That night, Seijiro inquired about Kenshin's facial scratches. He informed Seijiro that he received those scars while still a Batusai. Soon after, Seijiro inquired as to whether the person he would encounter was also a Batusai like him. Kenshin said that Makoto was far harder than himself, and that even Makoto's soldiers had defeated him in a sword combat. Following that, Kenshin states that Makoto is a very dangerous person in this nation, and he is prepared to go to any length to defeat him, even if it means sacrificing his own life. After hearing those comments, Seijiro began to move in order to assist Kenshin in learning the Hiten Mitsurugi method. But, before he teaches the technique, Seijiro wants him to think about his faults in previous fights. Kenshin attempted to think about what was wrong with him that night, but he couldn't figure it out until the next morning. That morning, Seijiro handed him a sharp sword and challenged him to a genuine combat so that Seijiro could teach him what he had been doing wrong all these time. The brutal fight between them has finally begun. Seijiro's true intention in this bout was to murder Kenshin. When Kenshin is trapped and almost murdered, he learns about the error that his instructor is alluding to. He realized he'd never been terrified of death while battling opponents all these time. Seijiro argues that Kenshin's guilt for his previous sins has rendered him weak and fearless of death. Seijiro advises him to have a strong desire to live and to begin thinking about his happiness in order to get stronger. Sanosuke, on the other hand, discovered that Kaoru had left her room and gone to the beach alone to locate Kenshin. Soon after, Sanosuke and Yahiko dashed to the shore to pick up Kaoru, who was still in critical condition. Then, after learning that Kenshin was sought by the Tokyo police, Kaoru persuaded them to accompany her to Tokyo to seek for Kenshin. Back to Kenshin, who has now mastered Hiten Mitsurugi's sword skills with the assistance of his instructor. Misao unexpectedly notified Kenshin that Kaoru was still alive as he was ready to leave Seijiro's residence. She also informs him that he has fled the government and would be killed in front of Makoto's army. Before Kenshin went, Seijiro advised him to be cautious and fight in order to return from the battlefield alive. Kenshin and Misao then headed to the Anawabanshu Inn to meet Okina before their trip to Tokyo. When they got at the inn, they discovered that Okina had departed and gone to the hidden way that Kenshin would later use. Okina came there on purpose to halt Aoshi, who was still preoccupied with vengeance against Kenshin. Okina fights Aoshi while still gravely hurt in order to awaken him rather than to get retribution. Unfortunately, since Okina's body is still not entirely healed, he easily defeats Okina and resumes his search for Kenshin. Soon later, Kenshin and Misao arrived at the scene, both rushing to rescue Okina. Aoshi finally met Kenshin after a lengthy wait, and their combat began. Kenshin attempted to battle Aoshi, who was still possessed by rage, while remembering Seijiro's advice to fight with the dread of death. Soon after, Misao attempted to assist him in defeating Aoshi, but Aoshi was able to effortlessly toss her body, causing her to tumble to the ground. Because of this encounter, Kenshin became even more determined to fight. Kenshin ultimately defeated Aoshi without killing him after a tough struggle. Kenshin recognized Aoshi was still preoccupied with the title of Batusai, thus he was willing to accept his challenge if he wanted to fight for the second time. Kenshin resumed his trek to Kamaya's dojo after the bout finished. Megumi, who had been anxious about Kenshin's health all along, met him as he arrived to the dojo. When she saw Kenshin was unkempt, she offered him a crimson shirt that Kaoru had left for him. Soon after, police from Tokyo surrounded Kamaya's dojo and detained Kenshin. Despite the brief skirmish, Kenshin eventually surrendered to the police so that there would be no more victims. Meanwhile, in Makoto's headquarters, Hoji warns Makoto that the burns on his body are worsening and that he can't battle for much longer. If Makoto fights for more than 15 minutes, his body will get hotter, and he might be burnt to death. Back to Kenshin, who has been apprehended by police and brought before Prime Minister Hito. Soon after, Hito apologized to him for having to sacrifice him so that Makoto and his army would not overrun the Japanese government. The police officers carried Kenshin to the beach that day, where he would be killed in front of Makoto and his warriors. Tokyo citizens, including Kaoru and her friends, flocked to see the execution. At the same time, Kaoru continued calling Kenshin's name and pleading with the authorities to halt the execution. Unfortunately, the execution was not stopped. After everyone had gathered, Hoji revealed all of Kenshin's errors from when he was still a Batusai by naming the samurai he had slain. The executioner prepared to behead Kenshin with a sword when Hoji completed reading all the names. However, the executioner abruptly freed Kenshin's hands and exposed his disguise in front of everyone. The executioner turned out to be Saito, and the execution was only a ruse devised by the police to allow Kenshin to approach Makoto. Finally, the struggle between government soldiers and Makoto's troops started. Then Sanosuke entered the fray and assisted the police in defeating Makoto's guys. Following that, Kenshin and Sanosuke accompany the remainder of the police force to Makoto's battleship, while Saito and the others attempt to beat Makoto's forces, who are still on a Tokyo beach. Saito, who beat hundreds of samurai during the shogun's rule, remains superior and can even defeat members of Makoto's 10 Swords army. When Kenshin and Sanosuke arrived aboard Makoto's vessel, they started battling against Makoto's men and other police officials. Kenshin engaged in hard combat with a monk who was one of the samurai of the army of the 10 Swords. Fortunately, despite suffering serious injuries all over his body, he was able to overcome the samurai. Kenshin, on the other side, must return to confront Sojiro, who previously vanquished him and threatens to shatter his sword. Fortunately, because to his master's hard training, Kenshin was able to dominate the battle and beat Sojiro until his sword shattered. At the same time, the Japanese government sent soldiers to open fire on Makoto's battleship. The commander of the army abruptly halted them and told them that Kenshin was still aboard the ship. On instructions from the commander of the soldiers, they continued to shoot at the ship. A fierce combat between Kenshin and Makoto, on the other hand, ultimately starts. Makoto seemed to be superior against him at first, since he could only perform defensive plays with no opportunity to retaliate. Furthermore, Makoto's blade can release very hot spurts of fire, making it much more difficult for Kenshin to confront him. Luckily, Saito arrived at the vessel, and along with Sanosuke, they attempted to fight Makoto. Not long later, Aoshi arrived to the ship with the intention of killing Makoto since he wanted to be the only one to beat Kenshin, the famous Batusai. As a consequence, Makoto is forced to battle 4 opponents at once: Kenshin, Saito, Sanosuke, and Aoshi. Despite the fact that Makoto was fighting alone, he managed to dominate the battle and defeat Saito, Sanosuke, and Aoshi. Yumi, Makoto's female assistant, soon discovers that Makoto has surpassed the time restriction for the battle and that his body is gradually heating up, so she asks Kenshin to halt the fight. But then something unexpected occurred. Makoto took advantage of the situation and stabbed Kenshin. As a result, he was forced to stab Yumi's body at the same moment. Makoto then took Yumi's lifeless corpse to the opposite side of the room so he could continue fighting Kenshin. When Kenshin saw this happen, he grew enraged and struck him violently. Kenshin ultimately terminated the fight with the Hiten Mitsurugi posture he learned from his instructor after a lengthy, tiring struggle. Hiten Mitsurugi cut Makoto's neck and sent him flying so hard that he tumbled to the floor with one stroke. Yumi's corpse was carried to the top of the steps by Makoto, who was already dying, before he died from overheating, which caused his body to burn out. With Makoto's death and the loss of his battleship, Japanese government forces defeated his army and secured Tokyo. When Kenshin and Sanosuke arrived on a Tokyo beach, Prime Minister Hito and other Japanese authorities received and honored the samurai. Kenshin's title as a Batusai has been legally withdrawn, and his reputation has been restored, according to Hito. The film concludes with a scenario in which Kenshin and his pals live in peace and quiet at Kamaya's dojo. After all they've gone through, he finally admits to Kaoru his affections and begs her to live with him in this new age. The video teaches us that although we cannot undo what has occurred in the past, we can learn from our errors and live our lives better now and in the future.